In the summer of 1888, a drifter cook named Samuel Moss arrived at the Broken Creek cattle station in western Texas with one strange rule. He would only prepare meat from animals that made noise before they died. The ranch hands thought it was superstition, but when men started disappearing during the night and familiar voices began calling from the darkness beyond the bunkhouse, they realized Samuel wasn't following superstition at all. He was following something far worse. The Broken Creek station sat 30 miles west of Fort Stockton, isolated among the scrubland and rocky hills that defined that corner of Texas. In June of 1888, the station employed 14 men who worked the cattle and maintained the property for an absentee owner based in San Antonio. According to the station's ledger, which survived in the county archives, a man identifying himself as Samuel Moss was hired on June 12th as the station cook after the previous cook quit without explanation. The foreman, a man named Clayton Rourke, noted in his personal journal that Samuel arrived on foot, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a set of butcher's knives wrapped in oilcloth. He was thin, somewhere in his 40s, with hands that bore the scars of years working with blades. When Clayton asked where he'd worked previously, Samuel mentioned cattle drives and mining camps, but offered no specifics. Clayton needed a cook. He didn't press for details. Samuel took over the kitchen building, a separate structure 20 yards from the main bunkhouse. Within 2 days, the men noticed his strange method of selecting meat. When a ranch hand named Thomas Welker slaughtered a steer that had gone lame, Samuel refused to cook it. He said the animal had been unconscious when it died, struck in the head before it knew what was happening. It hadn't made a sound. The next day, Samuel sent 2 men to kill a different steer, one he had selected himself. He instructed them to use a knife, not a gun, and to make sure the animal understood what was happening. The men thought he was crazy, but they followed his instructions. The steer bellowed and thrashed before it died. Samuel accepted this meat and prepared it without complaint. A ranch hand named William Torres wrote a letter to his sister in El Paso describing the situation. The letter, preserved in a private family collection, describes how Samuel would stand outside the kitchen at dawn and at dusk, listening to the landscape. If a coyote yelped in the distance, Samuel would send men to track and kill it. If birds called from the cottonwood trees near the creek, he would have them shot and brought to him. He only wanted things that had made noise, that had screamed or cried or called out before they died. The men found it disturbing but not threatening. Samuel cooked well. The meals were better than what they'd had under the previous cook. They ate and worked and tried not to think too much about the screaming cattle. On June 24th, a ranch hand named Peter Malone disappeared during the night. According to multiple accounts, including testimony later given to a county investigator, Peter had been sleeping in the bunkhouse with the other men. Around 2 in the morning, he woke several of them by sitting up suddenly and walking toward the door. When asked where he was going, he didn't respond. He walked out into the darkness, and no one followed him. In the morning, his bed was empty. His boots and hat remained beside it. Clayton organized a search. The men spent the day combing the surrounding area, checking the ravines and rock formations where a man might have fallen or gotten lost. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no body. Peter had simply vanished into the Texas night. That evening, as the men gathered in the bunkhouse discussing what might have happened, they heard Peter's voice calling from somewhere beyond the station buildings. William Torres, in his letter, described the sound as coming from the direction of the hills to the north. The voice called Peter's own name, like someone trying to get his attention. It called 3 times, then went silent. Several men grabbed rifles and lanterns. They searched for 2 hours but found nothing. The voice didn't call again that night. Samuel continued cooking. When asked if he'd heard the voice, he said he had. When asked what he thought it meant, he said some things learn to mimic what they've consumed. On June 27th, another ranch hand disappeared. His name was Douglas Perry. Like Peter, he walked out of the bunkhouse in the middle of the night without speaking. Unlike Peter, one of the men tried to stop him. A ranch hand named Joseph Carver grabbed Douglas by the arm and asked what he was doing. According to Joseph's later testimony, Douglas turned and looked at him with completely blank eyes. He didn't seem to recognize Joseph at all. Then he pulled his arm free and walked into the darkness. The men didn't wait for morning. They followed Douglas immediately, tracking him by lamplight. The trail led north, toward the hills, the same direction Peter's voice had come from. After a quarter mile, the footprints simply stopped. Not faded or obscured, just stopped, as if Douglas had been lifted straight into the air. The men returned to the station. They were afraid now. Clayton wanted to ride for Fort Stockton, to bring back law enforcement or soldiers or anyone who might help explain what was happening. But the horses were gone. All 11 horses that had been in the corral the previous evening had vanished without a sound. No broken rails, no tracks leading away. Just empty. That night, they heard both Peter and Douglas calling from the darkness. The voices came from different directions. Peter's voice called from the North Hills. Douglas's voice called from somewhere west of the station near the creek. Both voices called the names of other ranch hands, trying to lure them outside. No one left the bunkhouse. The next morning, Clayton confronted Samuel. According to William Torres, who witnessed the conversation, Clayton demanded to know what was happening. Samuel was calm. He explained that something lived in the land around Broken Creek, something that had been there long before the cattle station was built. It consumed living things, and when it did, it absorbed their sounds, their voices, their final moments of awareness. Samuel said he'd learned years ago that feeding it properly kept it satisfied. Animals that screamed, that understood their death, contained more of what it needed. As long as Samuel provided that, the thing stayed distant. Clayton asked why men were disappearing now. Samuel said he didn't know. Perhaps the thing was growing. Perhaps it had developed a taste for something new. The men held a meeting. They decided to abandon the station and walk to Fort Stockton. 30 miles on foot was preferable to staying at Broken Creek another night. They would leave at dawn, traveling as a group. Samuel didn't argue. He said they could try. They packed what supplies they could carry: canteens, dried food, weapons. As the sun set on June 28th, the men gathered in the bunkhouse and waited for morning. Outside, the voices started again. Peter, Douglas. But now there was a third voice. Thomas Welker, the same man who had slaughtered the unconscious steer on Samuel's second day at the station. Thomas was inside the bunkhouse. He sat against the far wall, staring at the door while his own voice called to him from the darkness outside. He was shaking. William Torres wrote that Thomas kept repeating that he hadn't left, that he was still here, that the voice wasn't his. The thing outside mimicked him perfectly. It called his name in his own voice. It said he should come outside. It said everything would make sense if he just stepped into the darkness for a moment. Thomas put his hands over his ears. Around midnight, the calling stopped. The silence felt worse. The men sat in the lamplight, watching the door, waiting for dawn. At one point, Joseph Carver asked Samuel how long he'd been feeding the thing. Samuel said he'd been doing it in different places for almost 20 years. Wherever he worked as a cook, he followed the same rule: screaming meat only. It kept things balanced. Joseph asked what happened in places where Samuel didn't work. Samuel said he didn't know, and he didn't care to find out. Dawn came. The men opened the bunkhouse door carefully, weapons ready. The station grounds appeared empty. No movement, no sounds. They formed a tight group and began walking east, toward Fort Stockton. They made it 400 yards before the ground opened. William Torres survived what happened next. His letter describes a collapse of earth, a sinkhole appearing directly beneath the group without warning. Most of the men fell into darkness. Torres managed to grab onto exposed roots at the edge, pulling himself back to solid ground. He could hear screaming below him. Not just the men falling, but other screams, older screams, animal and human sounds layered over each other like recordings played simultaneously. He ran. He didn't look back. He ran east through the scrubland until his legs gave out. Then he crawled. Then he walked. Then he ran again when he could. He reached Fort Stockton 31 hours later, dehydrated and barely coherent. The county investigator who filed the report, a man named Marcus Webb, rode out to Broken Creek Station with 6 armed men. They found the bunkhouse and kitchen intact. They found the sinkhole Torres had described, though it had partially collapsed and was now only about 8 feet deep. No bodies, no signs of the men who had fallen. The investigator's report notes strange markings in the earth around the hole, patterns that didn't match any geological formation he recognized. They found Samuel in the kitchen. He was preparing a meal. When asked about the missing men, he said they'd left without notice. When confronted about Torres's story, Samuel said the boy had gotten confused, probably sunstroke. The investigator arrested him on suspicion of murder. Samuel was held in the Fort Stockton jail for 3 weeks while the investigation continued. Multiple searches of the Broken Creek area revealed nothing. No bodies, no evidence of foul play beyond the strange sinkhole. Without proof, the county prosecutor declined to file charges. Samuel was released on July 22nd. William Torres's letter to his sister, written 2 days after his escape, ends with a description of what he heard while clinging to the edge of that sinkhole. He wrote that underneath the screaming, underneath the sounds of his friends dying, he could hear something else. A rhythm. A breathing. The sound of something enormous and patient, waiting in the earth beneath Texas, fed for years by a drifter cook who understood what it needed. The letter's final paragraph describes Torres's plans to leave Texas entirely, to move somewhere far from open land and isolated places. He wrote that he could still hear the voices sometimes, late at night. Peter calling his name, Douglas asking him to come outside, and underneath it all, that breathing rhythm, steady and eternal. The Broken Creek cattle station was abandoned permanently in August 1888. County records show the property changed hands twice in the following decade, but no one attempted to operate it again. Samuel Moss's whereabouts after his release from jail remain unknown. No employment records, no census data, no death certificate. He simply disappeared into the West, possibly still working as a cook somewhere, possibly still following his one strange rule. In 1923, a geological survey team reported unusual acoustic properties in the land around the former station site, sounds that seemed to originate from deep underground, but their findings were never formally published. The area remains largely uninhabited, and sometimes, according to locals who live near enough to notice, cattle still go missing from ranches on the outskirts of the county. Always at night, always without a sound.